So here we go. Today we're doing a chat with the Nibmeister. The guest is Josh Lax. So Brian there at Esterbrook connected us. He also sent your good work here, the scribe nib, for me to try out. You were at, was it the 2022 Nib Wars?
Yes. So yeah,
Yes.
last summer, so 2022.
And you won that.
I did. I have the title of the only person in the history of the world to win a nib modification competition. No one has ever done that before. It's questionable if anyone will ever again. Um, and not because I'm challenging anyone, it's just in the sense I don't know if they're doing the event again. So if it's a one-off, then I will hold it for all time. If they do it
World
again,
champion.
clearly, yeah, exactly.
So how'd you get into being a Nibmeister? Like, how long does that take? What does it look like?
All right, so I guess it looks like different things for different people. Three precipitating factors. One is that I get, and I didn't think of this consciously, but looking back on it, it's true for me. I've always thought it would be great when I grew up to have more than one job, to have like a regular job, a cool job, and then like I don't know, maybe some other thing. But I always thought it'd be when I was growing up, it'd be awesome to have a couple of different jobs. I become a lawyer, and I'm happy being a lawyer. I'm still a lawyer to this day.
Yeah.
However, I also became a fountain pen addict, and I acquired a number of pens. Now I came into the interest slash hobby kind of in 2009, 2010. And at that time, due to the economic downturn, it was very easy to acquire lots of pens.
Yeah.
And so I just wound up with a bunch of steel nib pens. And at some point, they're all sort of whatever they are, broad nibs, medium nibs, things like that. And I'm sort of like, well, what do I do with all these? Like, they got to be different.
They're all the same.
Yeah, exactly. They write very similar. So, I wanted, and I had gotten, I forget where, I was like a stub, I tried a stub. I helped found a pen club in the city, in New York City. So through that, I wanted to know how to grind a stub. Now, concurrent to all this, I was also interested in vintage pens. And vintage pens, the big thing is restoring. And I wanted to learn about restoring. And actually, I thought and I know I'm being a little meandering here, but suffice it to say, I wanted to know about vintage pens and restoring them. So Richard Binder in 2012 was giving a master class on nibs, and then he was giving a master class on vintage pen restoration. And the thing to know about Richard Binder is he's brilliant, and one of the ways he manifests his brilliance is he figured out how to do a lot of this stuff. There was no manual. You could look back at things and, repair manuals from Parker and stuff like that. But the more obscure you got, the more someone with engineering and methods and means know-how had to kind of like figure out how to do this stuff. So he's not the only one, but, he was like a main generator of sort of the way pens are restored and the way that nibs are worked on these days. And so I did the masterclass on restoration, but I was living in an apartment in Brooklyn, and you can't really have like a metal lathe, although I know someone in the city who has a metal lathe. But you can't really have like too much equipment. So the more sophisticated stuff becomes sort of inaccessible based on your living space. But, through that relationship with him that was established, I kind of learned some about nibs, and then I had him teach me more about nibs. But a lot of it is practicing kind of the skills and methods you learn on your own so you can master them. Mm-hmm. Right? Because as we're going to talk about, I'm sure, throughout the course of our time together, there's a lot of twists and turns, both literally and figuratively, when it comes to the sort of physics and mechanics of nibs. So from that perspective, a lot of it is learning once you kind of have like a framework to go from. So for the most part, I did a lot of practicing on my own in addition to the instruction. And then like many things, over time, you start to figure some other things out, or, you talk to colleagues, which it's kind of interesting when people are surprised that like other nib folks and myself kind of get together and hang out or talk
Hmm.
about these things. Like there's a lot of interplay. And it can be interesting. Like for example, like there's the Sean Monarch nib, right? So I
Yeah.
was at the Philadelphia Pen Show. It had just like released that week. People were just getting them for the first time. So I was there with Gina, and Gina had, I guess, gotten a couple of the nibs from Ian, and Gina ground them to a stub, or one of them to a stub. But the way Gina did that was totally different than the way I would do it. And it was just very interesting to see their perspective and their decision on how
Hmm.
to make this work. And it totally worked. And so, so that type of interchange happens, and
Yeah. They're
people
sharing
interact.
ideas.
Yeah, it's like a field of study in a way, right? Or not maybe it's like a discipline. Discipline's probably the right word.
So how many nibs do you think you have ground so far?
Oh boy. I mean, it's probably safely in the thousands at this point, just because of
Yeah.
the Esterbrook nib itself, and then like just since 2012 or so when I started doing this, or 2013. And I will say also, just so that people don't rush into it too quickly, I started learning this stuff like 2012, 2013. I don't think I took the step of actually doing something to someone else's pen until like 2016.
So let's
Yeah,
start off with a softball question.
a softball question. Hold on, I gotta. All right, good to go.
So here we have, these happen to both be Bach. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
One is
Yeah.
gold, one is steel. They're both a fine point nib. They both write
Mm-hmm.
wonderfully smooth. Are gold nibs smoother than steel nibs? Because everyone like this, we have this debate where it's just the iridium tip that's actually touching it. So
Yeah.
that doesn't matter on the material. I did a video where I talked about this. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, what was your conclusion? If I can answer the question with a question.
Sure. My conclusion, so I come at things from the physics side.
Yeah.
So I use an example of, well, it's essentially vibrations that you're experiencing.
Yeah.
At a microscopic level, it's dragging across the paper and there's tiny microscopic vibrations going on. So you feel that going through the pen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, steel, well, the one way to transmit vibrations is you look at the speed of sound that goes through material. So this is 14 karat gold, right? On about the type of steel they use here, it transmits faster, about twice as fast through steel as it does through gold. So it's going to essentially kind of dampen the essentially, well, yeah, if anything, it'll change the frequency, because it'll essentially be dampening some of those vibrations through the gold versus the steel. So, but it's tricky because let's say you get each nib and tune it to your best ability and go, this is as good as this fine Bach gets, and this is good as this fine Bach gets, one's gold, one's steel. If you blindfolded someone and you didn't tell them it's the same pen, do you think someone could tell the difference? I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
So that's a very interesting question. I've never done it. And so as a lawyer, I'm like, well, what's the implication of me answering a question with no evidence whatsoever? But I agree with your assessment of the physics, and that gold, and we'll come back to that in a second, that gold dampens or absorb, I would say absorb, but that's probably not very scientific.
It's whatever.
Some of the vibrations, right? So the answer, I would say, it's possible that you would detect no difference. Why do I say that? But it's possible that you might. It's not just like the metal absorbing the vibrations, right? It's like how the tipping is shaped, and is it perfectly rounded? Is there areas where it's not rounded? Is there areas where it could catch? So it's possible to smooth the tips on both of them in such a way, I think, that would avoid the average person's ability to detect the difference.
Okay.
The other thing that can happen, and I would say this, my experience has been not necessarily with two fine Bachs, but let's say two Jowo broads, because I use a lot of Jowo broads in my work and in my personal
Yeah.
pen usage, right? So you get some really nice nibs going on from Leonardo. And I got one of the more recent piston fillers had a gold nib on it, and then I got a similar gold nib, but it was steel. Sorry, a similar steel nib, same dimension, same everything. I could tell the steel nib was the steel nib, but I think what I was responding to was the way the top of the tipping is finished. So in other words, the gold nib probably just felt smoother because I could feel like a little bit less of the vibrations, but also I'm pretty sure that there was just something at the top of the tipping that was sort of rubbing against the paper that wasn't there on the gold. And
Okay.
I didn't actually do an experiment to see if you took that out, how different would it be? I can definitely say that I think for some people they would detect, like the stiffness of the steel depending on the nib. Bops tend to have more give to them. Not that
Yeah.
anyone should start like pressing on them, but they're just a little springier
This one
than
is a
Showas.
nice little bounce to it. Like I have,
Yeah.
this is the Enso Puma. This is the
Okay.
primer emulation 4 they have, but I have the same pen. It's in ebonite as well, and I've even swapped them. So both fine nibs, both fine point, and both Bach steel gold.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it just has that give to it. It is like it is actually night and day with these
Yeah.
ones, that the writing experience. So I guess a little bit too on the brand you might feel a bit more or something too potentially, or
Yeah. I mean, so so for everyone, I mean, we can get into all sorts of variations, but the thing to remember is that nibs get to your pens and to you in various ways, right? So there's, you can buy Bach nib units, the same that some of the makers of pens buy them, right? Like, for example, if you wanted to buy extra Bach nibs, Karas Custom sells them. And they sell them in quantities, so you can just reach out to them. And Brian Gray from Edison Pens has this website, Meister Nibs. He sells loose Chowos. However, that's not true if people are manufacturing pens and buying nibs at scale. And so some of the history of nibs and is kind of involves this dynamic where, like for example, Visconti may be buying nibs made by Bach at times, but they're buying it to spec. Same with like a Delta at one point was buying, I think, Bach nibs to spec. So, and then you get into the issue of then, no, I don't mean issue in a negative sense, but I just mean sort of the event of what happens in the factory when they're putting the pens together, and you have like the subjective view of whatever technician, assembling the pen and testing it to the extent they're testing, because not everyone does that. And so that's when they contract for nib manufacturing. Then obviously we have some great companies that are still making their own nibs, which include Aurora, Pelican, Lamy, Sailor, Pilot, Platinum. And what's I think kind of remarkable about a number of those companies that I just mentioned, they're manufacturing their own nibs, but some of those pens with their own proprietary nibs are eminently affordable, right? Like, you could find great deals on Pilot pens with super reliable nibs, and people love Sailor, and I think Platinum is great, and you can find the Platinum 3776 with a gold nib in a variety of sizes, for less than $150, something like that. But putting that aside, and so what happens there, right, is then you have people in those factories who have a viewpoint on how a nib should write, and that influences how they're doing it. So getting back to the original question, which is gold versus steel, right? I have, for example, I got a used one. An old Platinum 3776, and I say old, like 15 years old or something like that, with a steel broad nib, and I have gold Platinum nibs that are broad, and you can just feel like if you're paying attention to it, it's just like a little stiffer, but the smoothness is there, because how they finish the nibs, it's the same, So those differences between brands, I guess, is sort of what I was addressing.
Okay,
before.
gotcha. So you might notice it more in one versus another.
Yeah, but then they're also bear in mind, right? Joe and Bach are manufacturing thousands of these things, so
Hmm.
they're never going to be exactly the same all across the board every time because it just economically they can't QC everything perfectly. And I can tell you, I mean, I see it because I look at tons of these things under magnification. So
Yeah.
there's little differences. And if you think of how tipping is attached, right? It's basically like an explosion of energy that adheres or fuses the metal together, the two different alloys. And so if you think about if you were to just zap something, the same sphere again and again, would you always wind up with the same sphere? I mean, I don't think scientifically you could expect that, right?
No. Yeah. You always have variance.
Yeah. Yeah, so you always have variance. So sometimes you look at a Joe, it's a little flatter. Sometimes it's a little more rounded. Sometimes a little taller. They're just variations. So
Okay.
so that
So
that all happens.
the first question I thought we'd do is more for like users for basics. So what are
Yeah.
some basics that like fountain pen users should know about their pens, and obviously in
Yeah.
particular about their nibs? So this likelihood to improve their overall experience, like some do's and don'ts. You probably see some stuff that makes you cringe. So maybe talk about things that people should definitely do and things maybe not do.
So I'm sort of Obi-Wan Kenobi when it comes to nibs, and I'm just like, well, let the force flow through you. So I don't really I don't really have like cringe stuff from users. We could talk about other things that make me cringe later, but um, I guess for the basic user, right? So first thing to recognize is you're putting a liquid inside this thing, and what happens to liquid? It's going to evaporate eventually, right? So that is something to be conscious of for a couple of reasons. I'll say personally, my initial foray into fountain pens had two things happen. One is I got like the Muji $18 nib, and I
Hmm.
used their ink and their cartridge. Worked very well at the time for what I was doing, which was I was filling in worksheets, studying for the bar exam. I then went to a stationery store and said, "Hey, I just need a cartridge for this," and they're like, "Oh, here," and they sold me like a 5 pack of Mont Blanc cartridges, and I go to put it in and I start writing with it, and it's like bleeding into the paper like crazy, right? And so I thought there was something wrong with it. Well, so the first thing to recognize is it's a liquid, but it's a chemical, combination of chemicals, and they're all subtly different sometimes. So the flow might, some are more flow heavier, some bleed more, some soak into paper, things like that, right? The other thing is that it will dry out, which is the other experience that actually got me more into pens, because when my pen stopped writing, I basically had gone online to figure out why, and
Hmm.
that led me down the rabbit hole, so to speak, eventually, because I found all sorts of articles online about pens and pictures, and that was the end of me. What happens when it dries out, right? So you have sort of 3 points in the pen that you should think about, right? So you have the kind of the area that's exposed of the nib, right? So it's like the nib and then the feed, the black, usually black, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's more translucent. That area that you can see, yeah, I see you highlighting that, right?
Yeah.
And so, all right, so moisture is going to escape through that point into the cap and then out the cap and so on and so forth. Then there's the area of the feed that you can't see that is in the section, right? And that's sort of, moisture is going to go out that way. And then finally um, you have the ink supply, and the way what you're just showing now in the Esterbrook, right, is a converter. But let's say you have a piston on like a Twisby or a Narwhal, to name two very good friends. And basically what you need to be aware of is this. Let's say you've been writing with a pen, you leave it for a few days, you come back and it's like a little gunky, right? Like you can get a little ink smeared on the paper, but it's not really writing. You can submerge that in some water and just kind of rehydrate the tip, right? But the thing to be careful with, you can't keep doing that over and over again. At some point, the dehydration of the ink in the section area where you can't see will clog it up. So basically, the thing to recognize is like you're gonna have to clean these out at some point if you don't use them frequently enough.
Obviously, the opposite of ink is paper.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's
So
a
ink is
massive
paper.
difference in that too.
Yeah. And so, right. So going back to my example of my issue in the bar exam. So we were using these like workbooks, and there was these like worksheets that you would fill in. And so basically what would happen is, that was made on like newsprint. So it's like a super absorbent paper. The better papers we all think is quote unquote fountain pen friendly or just made differently. Some are actually coated with like a light ceramic coating. Others, it's just the way the fibers, I guess, link together. And actually, I'm not an expert on this. The biggest thing for people who are just starting out is when there's a problem, the thing to do is not get frustrated. It is to do research. Come back to the research in a second, but let me just say, like, what don't do is keep pressing on the nib, thinking if you press, like somehow it's like a tube of toothpaste, more is going to come out. It's just stuck in there. It just needs a little something. But that initial inclination to press, and I sometimes see that. And again, it's not a pet peeve or anything, but it's an observation, right? So you don't want to press. What you want to do is you want to think about, okay, is this dried out? You want to open, if you have a pen that unscrews, you can like see if the converter is dried out or the cartridge is dried out. That's a way to go. So that'll tell you if it's just dried out. When you fill a pen, it's really important for the usage to actually saturate and fill it as much as possible. Might seem like kind of like an obvious point, but again, going back to like what you can see and what you can't see. If you're filling something that has too much air in it, the air, airflow is involved in this whole scientific, physical, series of events, chain of events. But if you if you put in a cartridge, right, into your pen, and you have a pocket pen there, I could see. So you may have had the experience with like a cartridge. You insert it into the pen, and it's sort of like, when's it going to write, right? It takes time to like get in there, right? But then as it's going into, it's going from that cartridge down into the feed, and then ultimately to the tip of the nib, right? What's happening is air is backing into it. Now, so you got to let the sort of the air and the liquid of the ink displace. When you fill a pen, right, if you don't fill it enough, right, it doesn't have the same like kick in a way. And so you may start to get flow problems. So for someone starting out, I guess well, not guess, I know what I'm saying. For someone starting out, it's okay to like to fill and refill, let's say with a converter, like 3 or 4 times, just to like try and get as much of the air out of it as possible, and you'll have a better experience in the long run.
So what you mean is when you're putting it in the bottle, essentially, you go to fill it, you just drive that piston up and down 3-4 times or whatever, and then that air exchange and ink volume, that's done its thing, and you're in the best position to have the best writing experience.
Definitely. I mean, I would say that. And it's not just converters. Like if you get a plunger filler, you might find the same thing. A couple times. Piston.
I do that with. I got my Lamy 2000 right here. I do it a couple times up and down. And another tip too is let out a few extra drops of ink. I find on the piston fillers, is you let just like after you fill it, a couple drops, and then I'll turn it upside, right side up, and then tighten it up a little bit. I find sometimes just that initial bit, sometimes they'll maybe leak a little bit. Do you ever find that?
I have not, but I've heard what you're saying, and I think there's some truth to it, right? Because if you think of the physics of it, right, it's like you've filled it by submerging it, right? And so there's all this sort of like residual ink that came in because it's being held right in that space, particularly right at the front. And if you're gonna further like vacuum suck liquid in, right, that will draw it more deeper into the pen or more deeply in, and then it'll be less likely to leak.
We talked about maybe a pen being clogged up, not writing. What are some of the most common other things that someone might experience if their pen isn't writing quite right? Like to me, usually it's sometimes tines are out of alignment. I guess the nib and feed aren't quite aligned a little bit either. And sometimes you can also have that the tine gap is just too tight.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's get into the heart of it. if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
All right. So I hope almost no one or no one watching this video has had any experience with the criminal justice system. Why do I say that when I'm talking about Nibs? Well, we'll obliquely get to the point now about why. I'm full of pen puns. For those of you who are familiar with criminal law, you know that for an offense to be committed, under the law, all the elements have to align, right? Like the person has to have done the thing in the place all at the same time. Like it has to align, right?
Yeah.
So alignment is really interesting. I'll start that over in case you decide to edit this out.
That's all good.
Yeah, no, but so the first thing to know about Nibs is on a basic level is that it's an object in space, and it has to be aligned and operating in that space in a particular way. Yes, that's actually very, when they designed that, I don't even think they thought about that as a teaching tool. It's actually kind of perfect, right? So let's start actually, DB, right at the top there, okay? So what you're demonstrating, right, is alignment, okay? And so for the nib to work properly, the tines have to be in alignment. And that is alignment in multiple senses of the nib, right? So the first is that the actual tipping on the point of the tines has to be aligned, right? If you have one that's higher than the other, a couple of things are going to happen. One, it's going to be scratchy. Or two, it's not going to flow right. Now, why is that? Scratchiness may be an obvious point, right? Because it's like an edge that's exposed that's now dragging on the paper. But why is that going to affect flow? And that is sort of, again, goes back to this idea that things have to be perfectly aligned and working in sync. Because what allows the ink to travel from the ink supply to the tip and thus onto the paper is that there's capillary action. Now, capillary action happens when the two surfaces of the tines, the insides of the tines, are in the right proximity to each other. And if they are not in the right proximity to each other, they won't flow. So actually, one point to make, before we go on, using our teaching aid of the bookmark is, if you look at the slit, right, it looks like for the most part it's parallel. The tines are parallel between the two, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you look at your found pen nibs, particularly the ones that work great for you, what you'll notice is they're not parallel.
Yeah.
That they actually come to more of a point, because the capillary action will go from the wider point to the smaller point, or to from the wider width to the smaller width.
Yeah.
And that's what allows it to keep going in the direction you want. If your tines are parallel, what you'll have is the ink traveling back and forth. And it's kind of fun to watch it the first time, but it's going to be frustrating.
It's frustrating.
So that alignment in terms of like the tapering is important, but then the alignment of like the level, whether they're
up and down
or below, is important. Why is that? Because again, if it's above, if one tine is up and one tine is down, you're going to have a problem that there's no flow. But what will bring it back into flow is when you hit the paper, and the tines get pushed down. The one that's lower gets pushed up, and it now is sort of operating in the right proximity. You'll get flow, and what that problem or what that issue will manifest itself in is one of the many causes of hard starts. Hard starts can be caused by many different things. We can talk about all of them now, but just as the starting point, that's where the alignment. So it's scratchiness. It can affect flow. And things of that nature. So we can't really show it on this model here, but if you look at it, the nib head on, right? Not only does the slit or the space have to be like tapered going forward, if you look head on, your nib the slit needs to be parallel at that point. So in other words, in the ball of the tipping, the two inner walls have to be parallel. They can't be canyoned in either way, meaning it's like inverted to a triangle where it's like wider on the bottom and narrow on top, or narrow on the bottom and wider on top, right? It's really needs to be parallel.
Yes, I'm sort of using my fists, right? Like it's got to be, those are the two sides of the ball, right?
Yeah. like, I don't know if you can see me on my screen.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at it, right, you can't have it that way. You can't have it that way. Like a V or an upside down V.
Yeah.
It's got to be 2 lines. But that's, again, to be
At
clear,
the tip.
the head-on view. Yeah, the head-on view of the tip itself. One term for that is at least as I use it, is canyon, which Richard Binder came up with that way of describing it. So that's how, I don't know if other people call it something else, but so that's alignment. Then I don't know if this falls into an alignment situation. Well, it sort of does, which is so not only does the slit between the tines need to be tapered to go forward, it needs to be, like, I guess the best way to describe it is perpendicular to the base of the nib. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And in other words, if you pick up the bookmark again, right,
Yeah.
that you were using as a demo, right, you see how, like, if you were to draw a line going from the slit through the breather hole down to the bottom, right, it would form a perpendicular angle to the base, right? If you have it go to on a what's it called? If it's angled towards one side or the other, meaning when they slit it, that they didn't go head on, it like got slit on a slight angle, right? That's going to have an effect on the tip in 2 ways. One is one side of the tipping is going to be larger than the other.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that where it hits the paper is going to vary as your hand moves, right? And so that also may cause a problem. And so rather than, the other things I talked about with an alignment, you bring things back into alignment. There's different methods to do it.
Yeah.
This problem I'm talking about may require that the nib is reshaped to bring the larger side into
down to the smaller.
relative similarity with the smaller side.
I got a question for you. The tine gap.
Yeah.
Like I use feeler gauges.
Yeah.
Okay. And so the one I always go for is the 1.5 thou. So 1.5 thousandths of an inch, or 0.04 millimeter. So if I'm checking some pens, if I'm having some flow issues, I'm checking it and I'm just trying to diagnose what the actual problem is. That's what I sort of use as a bit of a guide. I'll slide it between the tines and sort of I'll feel that give, as a bit of a DIY method if you don't have a big microscope and all that stuff, to feel it should just sort of bite at the very end. But sometimes you can have it and you can't even get it through. Is that what are your thoughts on someone using feeler gauges to check the tine gap?
That's a great question. Hold on, now I'm looking at my brass shim. So I use, I guess that's about right. So I have, for various purposes, 0.02 millimeter brass shims.
Okay. Yeah.
And 0.02. So you're using 0.04, you said, right?
Yeah.
Okay. My understanding and my operating principle, but I'm willing to admit that I may be incorrect, but I've always been under the impression that the slit needs to be no more than 0.02 millimeters, or else you won't have flow. But I hear what you're saying, though, which is that you're sort of looking for it to catch as you're going up.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I kind of was trying that experiment with the brass shim. I think if you're finding that it's working, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And if it's yielding the results you want, right? What's the problem?
It is, yeah. On finer nibs, I go narrower. Like I'm restricted by what I have. Like I used to have all sorts of brass shims when I did my engineering. Where I got that number from, if I have the pen handy, I might not have it with me, but my Pelican. So I watched the video. I think it was Apple Boom. Went through and did a tour of Pelican. And let's just pretend this is a Pelican. But they would check each nib, and they were checking it was 0.04 millimeters, because I was trying to find out what's the gap supposed to be. So that's why I went with that. But Pelican does write a little bit different than other nibs too. And I do find 0.04 is too wide on some pens. Like it's too much. You'll actually almost have hard starting issues. But on other ones, it's sort of in the ballpark. So I'm probably, because the way I feel it, because you can feel the feeler gauge, it's interesting because it's like 1.5 thousandths of an inch, so 0.04, but you can feel a lot different. Like you can get better granularity if you have that sort of, they call it mechanics touch or machinist touch, right? You can gauge if it's maybe closer to 0.02 or 0.03 or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's for me. I'm sort of visually like attuned to it. I would say, I mean, I use 0.02 millimeters also because I think that's the sort of like standard for the most amount of space between the feed and the nib.
Okay.
Before you, but my experience is that generally they kind of got to be rusting. Part of it has to be sort of rusting, but you don't necessarily need to have that.
So you're talking about that gap in there.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but I mean, I tend to go more visually. So with some of these numbers, I guess
are tricky. Yeah.
Again, if it's working for you, I don't want to discourage you from doing it.
No, this is, I'm all just DIY, just kind of try it out and see how it goes, guy.
Yeah. The one thing I would just say for the folks at home is you got to just be aware of one risk when you're inserting metal between the tines, which is if you make a small abrasion, meaning there's like a little nick or a little line of some sort cut into the walls of the tine, you're going to get nib creep. Why is that happening? Well, you've just introduced a new channel for capillary action into that place in the metal. And so what will happen is over time, the ink will not only travel to the front of the pen, but it will actually go from the feed up to the top through that little cut in the.
It's like a fissure.
That fissure, like, because it's going to be very small. It's like perfect, right? And it's going to want to go up that way from big to small. So, and you'll get it on top. Again, not the end of the world, but it's like to have ink pooling up on the top of the nib is something, most people try to avoid.
So, I'm a big fan of the one pen many nibs, and especially, I mean, it can get insanely expensive extremely quick for fountain pens, right? So what if you're students or you just, you don't have much disposable income? One of the cool things is you get whatever pen, these are all kind of expensive ones, but you can get a pen that's maybe $10, $5, $20, whatever your price point. And then to sort of expand the collection without having to really empty out your pockets a ton is you can get different nibs, right? So whether it's just you have a pen with a Jowo nib unit and you've never tried a stub and you go, well, I don't, I can't afford to buy a whole new pen that's expensive, but I really like this pen. I want to try a stub. You can just go ahead, buy a stub unit. So anything that folks should be aware of when it comes to swapping nibs, or just some things that, again, do's and don'ts, or just some general guidelines? What works with what?
Yeah. In terms of nib units, there's sort of three. There's the proprietary stuff where you got to get it from the manufacturer, someone selling the manufacturer, right? But then there's Bach versus Jowo. Again, going back to, sort of like if you buy, something that's using the standardized units, right? They're all the nibs are basically around the same size, but inside, what's holding the feed and the nib together is what they call a housing, and the housing is designed differently. It is not a standardized setup by any means. So the first thing is to recognize that they're not necessarily interchangeable, and that actually you can't even like swap them between the housings because they don't perfectly sit to some degree. So for example, like the Jowo feed is manufactured different than the Bach feed.
Yeah,
and
I can tell right away.
And so like the Jowo housing sort of is like keyed to have a Jowo nib and feed in it, and then the Bach feed is keyed to it, but also has like at least in the number 6 housings, like a little nubbin thing that actually like aligns with a channel on the bottom of the feed. So and that can present issues because if they're not sitting together perfectly, you're gonna have flow problems. So that's like the first thing to recognize.
So keep brands the same. And actually, what I'll do is in the video description for everyone, I found a website a guy put together where he does his best to keep track of which pen manufacturers use which nibs.
Yeah.
So that way, if you want to switch it up, oh yes, Esterbrook use Jowo. This brand's use Bach. So if you want to swap stuff around.
Yeah, they're predominantly going to be one of the two. I think Narwhal uses a different sort of the same size, but like their nibs, I think, have the same housing as Moonman / Mahjong and Aspine. I don't know why that is necessarily, unless they're all from the same factory or they're all using the same parts manufacturer.
Yeah.
But so that's the first thing, is just to be aware of the sort of like, will it fit? Will it screw in? Will it not screw in? The second thing is to be careful when you're
Yes.
swapping, right? Because first of all, you should. I highly recommend, if you have a bike shop near you, they inevitably are going to have like a trash can filled with bike tube. And basically, where's my bike tube? I have bike tube right here. So basically, right, it's a rubber. It's a piece of rubber. You'll need to wipe out. There's some talcum powder on the inside. But basically, what I recommend is something like this. People use like the shelf liner, like that grid-looking shelf liner as a grip. So I recommend a grip, because it just makes life much easier, right? And so if you take your, so if you think about, you know, having a screw in, and I'm on camera with this too. You know, like kind of what you're doing is, you know, so you got someone screwed it in, it's a little tight, right? You don't want to snap the feed, because that's, you know, a problem. So if you have a grip, some sort of grip, it makes it easier to do. Now, I recommend gripping like
top
with
and bottom.
the bottom of the feed, top and bottom. We'll get back. There's a caveat to that, but right, top and bottom. And usually they're threaded to go counterclockwise out, right? And then clockwise in. So that's one, you know, basic piece of it. Some brands sometimes glue the section in the housing into the section. So you don't want to force it, because then you'll snap something else, and that could lead to a more extensive repair.
That's like this one right now. I'm trying to turn it, and I'm like, I'm having to apply more pressure than I think it's worth. And then it's just like, well, just leave it. You can just slide it out.
Yeah, so that's the other thing you can do, right? You can slide some of these. Some of them come in and out easier than others. Again, that's where the gripper is really important. Now, the first time, at the very least, the first time you do it, and you're going to pull a nib out of one of these housings, do not. I shouldn't say do not. Let's start with a positive. Do. What I recommend is to have one of these rubber grippers, bike tube, liner, what have you, and you want to approach it and rest the nib side into the rubber material, or the gripper material, right? And then you can rock it back and forth, holding the nib, but don't press on it, just grip it firmly, and sort of gently pull away, as you know, rock it back and forth, and it will eventually come out. Why you need to do this at the very least the first time is, the plastic housing will actually loosen up as you do this more and more. But you know, that is going to be made much easier if you have something that actually increases your grip on it and does it. I recommend doing it all the time. You know, don't you know, go. It's just easier. Precision is the thing, right? So like, I'm doing this on an Esterbrook medium nib for the first time, and it's tight, but I'm getting it. But every subsequent time you do it, it's probably going to be a little easier. Now, what I would say just in general is, if you can avoid pulling things out of the housing, I would strongly recommend that.
So unscrew the whole housing first, and then if that's just not going to happen, you can pull.
Yeah. I know there's people that will clean the nibs out by like pulling them out and like doing it. Yes, it's quicker, but you know, you kind of risk damaging more every time you do something like that. So I would say, you know, be cautious with it. Another big problem, let's see, do I have an example? Mont Blanc is actually an example. Mont Blanc are difficult nibs to take out to begin with, but you got to pay attention to the feed itself. So gripping the nib unit, there you go. It's a lovely Mont Blanc. If you turn it, Nate, towards the camera, right, and you can see that one is actually not that bad. This is a 149.
Yeah, this is a split feed.
Yeah, if you, some of the newer ones, or the you got to be careful with the feeds because you don't want to crush the fins. I just know Pen BBS was like this. Like if I remember people wanted to switch the nibs out, but you would see like pictures of like crushed feeds.
Crushed.
Yeah.
Mahjong,
Again,
the P136, their Mont Blanc 146 kind of knockoff. That one, because the fins are very, very thin and soft. If you pull it, they bend quite a bit.
Yeah. So that's why it's safer to kind of go with the grip on the nib. Actually, can't see what I'm doing. But you know, if you think of the nib, right, like the grip right there. And now the other thing is if you have something with very fragile fins, one way to deal with that is to just there's usually a non-fragile part, right? Yeah. And to kind of work that in, you know, that being your pressure point, which is what I would do with the Pen BBS nibs. If I swapped them, you know, I would try to avoid ever touching the that area where the fins are because it just, you know, sort of looks atrocious if you crush them. So that's one thing to pay attention to.
So let's say someone now, you know, they've tried out other nibs, they've swapped it, the one pen many nibs, but then there's sort of a limit with what you can kind of get regular retail. So that's where you've done some work with Esterbrook and got into, obviously, because you went down the rabbit hole yourself and now you're doing it for others, is you did your custom grind. So this is your scribe nib. So it's like your interpretation of an architect, I guess. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's an interpretation.
Okay.
It's actually a variation. And sort of I guess there is an aspect of interpretation, but we can come back to that in a second. It's not really a design thing. It's sort of the name and things like that. But yeah, so what happened was the idea was to do an architect that could be sold standardized throughout, you know, the vendors, whoever's selling and people buying Esterbrook's. Now, unlike some of the other grinds we could talk about, like a stub, for example, you are talking about something that generally is somewhat bespoke to people. Why is that? And I think you well know, and you've actually talked about it on this program before, is that, you know, you're cutting an angle into what is an otherwise rounded object.
Yes.
And you're doing it in a way that's sort of, you know, I don't know what's the best way to put it. You're doing it in a way that is sort of personalized, right? Because you know, and I could see, so for example, just looking at the way you're writing with this right now, right, is it's sort of like a 45-degree angle, maybe you're like 50, something like that, right? I mean, I could tell you for me, I'm higher. I hold the pen, maybe because I have bigger hands. I also think lawyers tend to write at higher angles, just anecdotally. That's something I noticed. And it might be because we're like writing on documents and stuff like that, so we get used to doing it. But yeah, so I'm at like a 60-degree angle. So, you know, if I make an architect for myself, I'm doing it different than I am doing it for a lot of other folks. So what does that mean? How does that impact the design of the scribe, right? So the scribe, because we were selling it, or they're selling it through, you know, dealers and others to the marketplace, we needed to develop a nib that was going to feel good and work in some way for the a lot of people, but ideally the most amount of people possible, right? Because you know, we want people to be able to enjoy it at different levels, right? So what that meant was I kind of prototyped several different arrays of it. You know, like it's all about the cuts and the smoothing and the rounding. So I did a couple different versions of it, and I sent it to Kerry at Esterbrook, who's also known as Fountain Pen Day, who kind of had the idea, and then I sort of developed it. And what ended up happening was he sort of tried them out and told me what he thought was the best one, and we sort of just went into production with it from there. Like many things, I think I have no problem admitting, like, I think I've figured out some things that have made, you know, like the first things better since like the first batch. So, you know, if you try the first batch. It might look and feel a little bit different than subsequent runs we've
Iterations.
done.
Yeah.
Yeah, iterations. Well, there's really only like that initial one, and then sort of like the one that it's the same thing. It's just how I do it, I think, is a little better.
It just gets a little more refined, and there's just tiny little details, just little subtleties.
So I'm just showing you as an example, what we were talking about before is, little refinements get made, right? This is not a scribe. This is just an Esterbrook medium. But basically the area like over here, if you have an older one, right, you might see that it's a little wider over here. And on the other side, the same thing, like right there, it's like a little bit wider. Since the beginning, I've learned that taking it a little bit down, a little bit further, actually like improves the writing experience. So it's things like that, right? If you think about it, just to kind of drive home the point, since we're working in the magnification zone right now, right? So if you think of that, you're going to cut an angle into this, right? Right, you're going to look how rounded this nib is. And so you need to be able to round out. Sorry, let me get this in focus. To make the scribe successful, it was sort of like making sure that all these different rounded edges sort of continue through into the finished product, right? Because it's these rounded edges on a nib that make it something that a number of people can use, right?
Yeah.
And just, again, going back to some of the things that people might experience and the explanations for it, trying to get the best angle with the light. So I mentioned earlier in our discussions, right, that in the, sometimes there's the top of the tipping, right? So if you look at this nib, it's actually really good, I think. You see how the top of the tipping is sort of rounded?
Yeah.
And there's actually no hard edges there. I can adjust the camera to get the light a little better. There you go. Right. This is what allows you to push the pen up when you're writing. So in other words, to go up with the pen,
your upstrokes,
across the paper. That is, if that wasn't there, or if that wasn't finished properly, it's going to be scratchy. Same thing with going downwards, right, and upwards. The bottom and the top, both of them need to be rounded. So when designing the scribe, and just for clarity, the scribe is on a broad nib. We needed to maintain sort of that rounding, right? If you were writing for yourself, you would find that you were maybe able to avoid those catches. But even when you do an architect for somebody, or at least when I do an architect for somebody, I am trying to make sure the top and the bottom is very smooth. But I think when you actually did your video on it, you tried it at different angles, right? And so that sort of was the byproduct of the design, in the sense that it actually, you can write it at different angles, and you're going to get different line variations, depending on where you're hitting on it. So actually, like it gives a lot of freedom in terms of someone's hand moving around, which I think was not necessarily what I was thinking, but it actually is nice. And so getting back to the idea of the interpretation, the reason it's called the scribe is that when it became apparent that the nib had that capability, in other words, where you could do a swoop down and get a really wide line, and then as you go back up, it thins out, and then but it can like move crosswise or on diagonal with some line variation, things like that. I started thinking about my trip to Turkey in 2010. And in 2010, my wife and I went. We had a great time. The aesthetics are so impactful there, various ways. But one of the things that stuck with me was the what's called a turga, which is the Sultan seal. So in Turkey, the predominant religion was Islam, and like several religions from that area of the world, there's you don't depict human or animal figures as part of art because it's a form of idolatry. So, like other cultures in that area of the world, things like letters took on their own value or their own art and their own spirituality, and that's true in Hebrew, and that's also true in what's it called, in Arabic. And so when playing with the nib and developing it, it just seemed like that idea of like those letters coming through really jumped out at me. I myself have, know Hebrew, know how to write it. It's written with a similar type of nib. Like, in fact, the architect nib is sometimes called like a Hebraic nib or something like that, or Semitic nib, because you can write kind of the characters in Hebrew and in Arabic with it. So to me, sort of like, the idea, sort of the interpretation came second, which was I was seeing something emerge on the paper from this thing I had created, which was exciting. And when we were working together, Esterbrook and myself, trying to think about what do we call this thing, I kept coming back to that, and I think it, the guys also found it compelling. So that's sort of where the interpretation came into it.
There's a guy in my office. He's originally from Iran, and he studied calligraphy.
Yeah.
So I gave him yours, and I have a few other architects, but he really liked how this one was over the other ones. And that's one thing I noticed is, like, when I did mine, yes, I get the line variation, but if you go slightly outside, it's like super fine point, super scratchy, all that. With yours, you can change those angles and still get the line variation, but also even just get a different experience, but it still writes nice and smooth. So there's architects are typically like pretty rigid, like especially mine, it's a chisel, but yours, it's like you said, it's more dynamic. It be used it's tough to make a grind like this suit as many hands as possible, but I think you've done a really good job of that.
Thank you. What I would say is that, if you think of like the two traditional grinds of like cursive italic and stubs, like an architect is sort of like a cursive italic, where it's less forgiving, but the reason for that is that you max out the line variation. This is more like a stub that's more forgiving, and you get some more rounded stuff going on, and it can be interesting, but you're just never going to get that like super dramatic, like, line across or line down, obviously, depending on
that hairline.
That hairline. So that, so we knew we were giving up a little bit of it to accomplish it.
It might not be quite as razor thin, but the benefit is like so many more people can enjoy it.
And it's a little rounded. I mean, I guess it's sort of similar in some ways to like a Naginata Toji nib, but my experience with those is that they're not as forgiving as this, because they come to a much more pointed angle atop deliberately, and they can be very fun, but any sort of matchup is sort of accidental in nature,
One I want to chat about really quick. I sent you some pictures from a viewer. And their pocket pen went into the wash. It's a titanium nib on it, and it got hoopa juped. And so I told him, I gave him my opinion. It was actually an Enso pocket pen. I don't have it with me, the exact one, but they're a little titanium one. I love that little pen. But I said, the replacement cost on that versus sending it to someone like you or someone else to redo it is probably about the same. If you get a new one, you get a brand new nib, no challenges. But first and foremost, like, do you really love the nib that was on there? Like, now's your chance to change it if you weren't in love with it, or go for something custom. And so I sent the picture to you. I'd like you to say your analysis of it, and then also sort of talk about when is things to think about, like, if a nib is too far gone, when is it time to call it quits? Or I guess on mega expensive pens, you might try a bit more because it's mega expensive versus just an off-the-shelf $40 nib or something.
Yeah. So I guess with that first in mind, obviously the first question you ask is, what is the cost to repair this versus a replacement, versus can you even get a replacement, right? And can you get it easily? So I think now we operate in a world where, because fountain pens are so much more popular, it's easier to get the nibs, replacement nibs. I feel like when I started acquiring pens, I don't want to say collecting because that would give me too much credit for like a forethought into what I was doing. When I started acquiring pens, it was harder to get replacement nibs. Just as you kind of had to go to the manufacturer. There's like a lot of premiums to it, you know. So the pictures you sent me, right, are the sort of the Bach number 6 titanium nib. First thing I just want to say about that nib is it's a lot of fun, but it's very fragile. And so it can be tricky in a lot of different ways. And actually, I think it's less crushed than I thought it would be from going through a washing machine, or a dryer, or both. But basically, I mean, if you look at it, right, the tines are like in 2 different orbits, right? Like they live in 2 different universes. So that's like a fairly expensive type of repair, because it's very time consuming, and it can go off the rails very easily, right? Because if you think you're like bringing 2 pieces of metal back into equilibrium, it's challenging. It can be done. It definitely can be done. It just, it's a long, timely process to get it right. But I would say that, you might, the job that I would do, I would want to do it, and it would be an expensive proposition for the customer. Can you get it manageable at a less expense? Maybe, but it's never going to be great. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate. But
so a new nib would just be better. Like it would just, even if you got that one in alignment. Yeah, it might be.
It's really just a cost benefit analysis. Like is the cost the same, or can you get the nib less expensive than a repair? And I typically, like, if someone came to me with like a Lamy Safari nib that had gotten crushed in some way, I'm like, listen, you can find this for like $8. Like, you don't need to pay me, multiples of that to fix it. And I've had it with other things too, like a really chewed up like Pelican M200 nib, right? Again, not, if it was gold, very different story, but as a steel nib, you might actually find a replacement nib for less than what I or my colleagues might charge to repair it. Depending on its age and things like that.
See, like we're saying, there's this cost analysis. So I found this Mont Blanc M pen at about 1 o'clock in the morning on Facebook Marketplace for $20.
Yeah. Yes.
And so it was all the guys like, the nib screwed up, it needs a new nib. And I was like, hell, for $20. I thought he was trying to scam me. I ended up getting it. I held it right away, knew it is real. And so I quickly gave him the $20 that he wanted and took the pen, but put some work into it. And I don't know, 3 hours later or something, I recorded it as I went. This thing's wicked. It's tons of fun. So on something like that, you're like, give it a try. But on other stuff, you're not finding that very often. But if the replacement cost is like $8, just call it quits and just get a new nib.
Yeah, unless there's a sentimental value or some other value. I mean, I'm not discouraging people from getting nibs fixed in any way, but I just, it's something to think about. Where, let's say in the 80s, someone took the final exam for their license or degree, something like that, and they did it with like, a Waterman, not Hemisphere, but like one of the Waterman models that were like, lacquered at the time, whatever, steel nib, fine pen, really great pen. And then, they were using it and it dropped, or their child picked it up and jammed it into the thing. Yeah, it's a steel nib. You might be able to find a replacement for that nib unit fairly economically, but that's not the nib you wrote your final exam with.
Yeah.
And you want your final exam pen. And so that to me would be, a great example of let's put the time and effort into getting this back to exactly what it was you used at the time, you completed this great achievement or something like that.
That's like Grandpa passed his hammer down to you, and you could go and get a new hammer that's like less hard on your forearm where you pound the nails, but this is Granddad's hammer, so you use his.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let's because I showed a couple pens there really quick of ones I ground. I told you to check out some of my videos of ones I've done. I do them. I just want to give it a try. I sharpen knives and straight razors. I have the gear, and I thought I should be able to do this to a nib. What's the big deal? And so my first pen I did was a cheap Chinese pen, like a $3 pen. Did it to a cursive italic. And then I'm not kidding you, the second pen I did was my Mont Blanc 149. And the reason
Yeah, I think I
was,
watched that video.
yeah, I sent it off and it came back like, I want to say who it was, but it was bad. And I'm like, if someone's going to screw it up, I might as well do it for free. So I practiced and felt really good about it. And it came out and I absolutely love it. So that's why I wasn't so much of afraid to try it. But my process is wildly different than the gear you use. And mine are just me kind of goofing around. I've done maybe, I don't know, 10, 20 nibs total ever versus thousands upon thousands and studying with someone. So feel free to lay it into me on some of the stuff. But it's good because it'll also give people perspective. Like the folks who have emailed me asking me to grind nibs for them, I'm like, no, that is wildly different than someone at your level. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
So I would say, I guess my first action is sort of Zen, and I would say, well, if it works for you, then it is a proper method. You have not destroyed it, and therefore it lives on. But I really do mean that. Like, all kidding aside, like if it achieved the result that you wanted without damaging it, then
Cool.
you are very much should feel entitled to follow that methodology. Now, like many things, as you are, an engineer, you're aware, right? There are advantages and disadvantages to different methods, right? I would say that in watching the methods you follow, kind of using the sharpening stone and then the micro mesh, the main difference between how you're doing things and how, say, I'm doing things, in other words, like I'm using a grinder with like drums and diamond wheels and things of that nature. The main advantage I have is that for those cuts and those grinds, I get a lot more precision because I'm holding the pen and approaching the moving object. And I'm looking at it. Yeah, and I'm looking at what's happening. Exactly. And I also can get cuts into it that you can't. And actually, if you want some examples, I can sort of show folks sort of why some things work a little better with the machine, but why other things don't need that. Right. So, for example, I'll start out with this example. Right. So this is a oblique cursive italic. Right. Now, you were able to achieve basically what I achieved on the stone, right?
Yeah.
And frankly, I didn't do any more cuts on the bottom or the front of it than you did on the stone, right? Mm-hmm. And hopefully that's in focus.
It is.
All right. But if you look at the top of it, right, I rounded parts of it a little bit, which you might be able to do on the stone, but you may have some difficulty with it, right?
That's it. Yeah.
But overall, right, I think we can agree that on the stone, you can get, and then obviously smoothing with abrasives like sandpaper and micro mesh and stuff like that, you can achieve this, right? Like it's possible to do it. Now, what's an example of something that becomes more challenging in terms of how you're doing things? So I actually special for the Doodlebud appearance was grinding nibs with this exact point in mind. And let me get my little pointer, which
I'm going to guess going like grinding down is nearly impossible. And
wow, so you were very much we're in tune. Because that's exactly what it is, right? Yeah. Again, with the pen puns, hold on, sorry, let me just. Yes, so you're absolutely right with the needle point nibs. You are definitely talking about a situation where you need to that. Now, as you can see, right? So, I mean, if you look at what the starting point is of a nib, right?
Yeah.
And then you compare it, right? You can see that there's I've shaped this in a big way. This started the needle point started as an extra fine. This is obviously a medium, but I'll flip it over now, and you can kind of see already like some of the issues, some of the things that happened that you couldn't really do on the stone and not do well. So first of all, I have reduced this from the sides, right?
Yeah.
And it is very fine. I don't know if you can actually see on this, trying to angle it to the light so you can see how fine it actually is.
Yeah, it's very fine.
Yeah. And then I also follow a methodology where you actually kind of take off material from the bottom,
Okay.
and then you do these side angle cuts. And if anyone has a monop nib from Ian, you'll perhaps have seen similar cuts in the side of it, right? And that's all done on the wheel. And you take off the top, you take off part of the bottom, you really bring it in. And so this is, just so everyone knows, this is unpolished. Like if you got a very itty bitty nib for me, it would not come looking like this. I'll show you the finished product in a second. But that is, so those types of cuts, right, become difficult to do with precision, because you want, again, like we were discussing earlier, everything to be equal proximity, and so, and to be smooth and to be at its maximum smoothness, you need this nib to be the same on either side. Like it's got to be symmetrical in pretty much every respect, right? And you can see that it's a little got some burrs and stuff like that. That all, we take care of that. But that ultimately, when I'm grinding this, I keep checking it to make sure, like, the side cuts, the angle cuts, they all look as close to being the same as possible. So that's some of it. And then, with the finished product though, I'm not doing that much different stuff when it comes to your what you were doing with the micro mesh and stuff like that. Yeah. The one thing that I did is to polish this and obviously you have my thumbprint on it. Hold on one second. What you're doing is not that what's not that different. One thing I did is I polished this, and you can see, like, a little bit by the tip is still there's some machining marks. Yeah. But I polished this using like a muslin wheel, with green rouge in it, right? Yeah. To give it some more shine. The bottom is still a little bit less polished, which that doesn't bother me. I think it actually helps with the capillary action. But I want from the top it looking pretty much as close to perfect as possible.
Yeah, I have some leather strops that I loaded up with the greened polish meant for like stainless steel, that type of stuff. Sometimes I'll do that if I really want to make it shine up, get rid of some of those marks as well. Yeah.
So one thing when I was testing it, I was sort of comparing the hairlines to the lines on the paper.
Yeah.
And trying to see what was thinner. So I'm curious if you have an opinion.
It is, from there, it's tricky. I would say it's a touch thinner on the lighter strokes for sure.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I don't have a means to measure the strokes at all, but
that's easy peasy. So you get yourself a calibration slide. They're like $5-10.
Yeah.
And you could use the zoom thing on your phone, or if you get a microscope and you could put it over top, and it's all has all the divisions, very, very fine. You can measure your line widths.
Interesting. I want to do that. I know that you can get a microscope to do that, but they're very expensive. So
the microscopes that have the eyepiece, it's essentially a reticle in there to do the measurements. Mega expensive, but you can get a little calibration slide picking up on Amazon. Mango chutney. Do you use mango chutney? What's your thing that you use to write to test?
So I do mango chutney. I do Egypt.
I did mango chutney one time. I was doing a nib for someone. I think she's on Instagram, Carrie Bullet Journal. Yeah. And she's in Canada here as well. And so we were chatting. She sent me some gorgeous drawings. And so I did a nib up for her. And it was a cursive italic on the Amazon Basics. It's not that great of a pen. But I thought, let me at least make it cool. And I was checking my work, and something seemed just a touch off. And then I threw down the mango chutney. And it caught like just the one little spot where it was just missing a touch, or I just grabbed. And I went, because like changes strokes like from one direction to the next. I found it just has
Yeah.
all those the kind of harder transitions. Some of those words you like where you're going one way than the other. And I do all sorts of different stuff too, but for me, that's sort of one of those. It has to just hit
Yeah.
it just right, especially some of those strokes. I'm waiting for it. Oh, is it going to do it on the back one? Oh, great, it's smooth.
Yeah. You know what? Maybe this is a great time to talk about scratchiness in the ways that we
Yes.
have not addressed already.
Oh,
All right.
and also too, keep in mind, there's
Yeah.
a viewer question. They
Yeah.
wanted to, actually, a lot of people were knowing. Some want to know, how do you get a pen smoother? But a lot actually want to know, how do you get more feedback, and how is like sort of feedback generated too? And in particular, Sailor. So they have sort of their own unique writing experience, and it
Yeah.
is toothier. So as we're talking about smoothness and that type of stuff, if we can sort of bring into feedback how it's
Yeah.
generated, maybe create more of it, and maybe some comments on Sailor nibs.
All right. So actually, they all run together. So it's
Perfect.
a great series of questions. So, and this actually maybe is worth me diagramming and holding up to the camera. So so if you think about like the broad Joe, you can kind of see this with the naked eye, right? It really looks like a tomato with a line down the middle of it. If you kind of look at it from the front. The sailors are actually kind of like done in this like sort of like interesting way. The writing surface, meaning what the point where they're designing the nib to actually touch the paper, is like a teardrop shape. And then on the upper level of the teardrop, there's these like cuts that are like kind of like little ovals that are cut into the surface of it, and that's how they make it. And it's going to look kind of like Gary Oldman as Dracula, what I'm about to hold up, but it's right there. That little,
okay, I got you.
Kind of looks like a cocoa melon
yeah,
thing, right? Looks like something else too, but we'll leave that for the viewers to decide. But basically, there's this like teardrop thing, and so what you're feeling a lot of the time is like those little like angled cuts that are in the top of the nib, the edge that's formed at the sort of the upper levels of the teardrop. Yeah, that's an edge that's actually you're hitting the paper. So it's really interesting actually, because one thing that is a difficulty, right? I think people sometimes think like we can make a nib right, like they don't even have a hand. I want this so smooth. It's like I don't even have an arm. The words are just appearing on the paper, right? Somewhat of an impossibility. However, it's really interesting to me that people kind of want a little more feedback, right? So how do you achieve that? So one thing is to understand how like a nib is smooth in general. So when I finish a nib, and this is not really what your industrial level nib people are doing per se, but basically you're starting with an abrasive that can remove material at a faster rate. So for example, like if you have like the nail files, right?
Yeah.
Like you think about that, right? This is from Micromesh. It's like basically a nail file, right?
That's how I did my 149.
Yeah. So it has the black, right? The black that is the most coarse. Then it goes to the pink. Then you got the white, and then you got the gray, which is I think 12,000, right? Yeah. And so what happens is, like, if you're gonna shape a nib, right, and it's the same thing with the grinder. Like, if you're gonna start shaping a nib, you're gonna go from the thing that cuts the most material off, the thing that removes the least material, to the thing that smooths it, right? What is it that happens though in that process, right? You're moving material and you're sort of removing, you probably can explain this better than me as an engineer, but you're basically, right, you're taking, as you remove material, right, there's the friction of the cutting materials are removing or making grooves and stuff in it, right? Yep. And so as you go to the finer abrasives, right, you're removing kind of the peaks of all those.
Yeah, you're getting rid of the scratch pattern and the little peaks and valleys.
Exactly, right? And you're just bringing it down, right? Now, again, capillary action. You got to remember that, like, those little valleys that are formed in the what's it called, in the process of smoothing it, those allow capillary action to improve. Yeah, and so the ink can actually lubricate the front of it, right? When you over polish it, right, you've removed theoretically a lot of those valleys, and it's like a mirror, and there's no area for the ink to go into. And so what you have, it actually it feels scratchy, because it's like, if you think of if you laid a mirror on its back, poured a little water onto it, and then push your finger in, right? At some point from you pressing in, you'll push all the liquid out from under your finger, and your finger will start to like almost like stick and like slide and skid across the mirror, and will be uncomfortable. Like it'll actually pull your skin. Yeah, so you lose lubrication if it's too polished, right? So that's not what you want, right? When we talk about feedback, so there's a possibility that the feedback that's bad is coming from that. So I would discourage people from over polishing if you can. That's sort of like an FYI. Okay. In terms of adding feedback, right? You know, sort of being
people might be tempted to drop down. So if they normally finish on 12,000, they go to an 8 or 6,000. That would, in theory, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that, you know, like, so the reason I was describing this whole mirror phenomenon is that when it gets over polished, sometimes the simplest solution is to just rough up the tipping. Yeah. Like literally like take like the 2000 sandpaper and just sort of like brush it lightly all over so you don't form any like edges. But that's what will perhaps give you more of that. Now, I will say that I've had experiences where someone using like cheap loose leaf, it actually feels smoother to have a less polished nib, I think, because it gets more lubricated between the fibers and the nib, right? But that, I think, is probably the place to start, is that you don't over smooth it and you actually dial it back a little bit and you don't do that final thing. I think that some folks, in the nibs that they like, though, what they're not feeling is like a lack of polishing. What they're feeling is that the top of the nib, a la Sailor, but in many different variations, is a little bit sharp and has a little bit of a burr. And so they kind of like that. I would propose that it's actually the initial thing you and I were talking about, which is to not go as fine with the abrasive, might be better in the long run for that feeling than say the burr. Right? I don't know. That's just my opinion.
That's your view on it, because you deal with nibs all the time and go, well, there's always multiple ways to get to the same result, and sometimes like you said, when I forget who it was, you mentioned she ground the monarch nib to a cursive italic, she approached it a different way than what you would have, but it worked out quite well, right? So there's always different ways to get to the same result, but each one has pros and cons.
I mean, if you take the Sailor for an example, right? Like the Sailor, like there's nothing wrong with how they cut the nib, you know, and shape it. It's just the finishing sort of is either you're going to like it or you don't. You know, I don't particularly love it because I, again, write at a higher angle, so I get more of that. Okay. You know, if you're at a lower angle, that's fine. Some people, as you're pointing out, like a little more feedback, and so that's what it is. So scratchiness, I guess we were sort of talking about scratchiness as an overall concept, and you know, I said it all fed together. So scratchiness is either the tines are misaligned in some way, either the tines are different sizes, and so as you're writing with it, you know, like it's doing funky stuff because it's getting pushed around, the ink flows in and out, like it's a whole bunch of things. Or it's this over polished phenomenon described out of the mirror, where it's literally like there's only friction between, there's no flow, and there's flow, but there's no adherence or lubrication. So it's friction between the nib and the metal and paper, or it's burrs and little edges. And you most frequently, I think, find that when it comes to burrs, it's an issue at the top of the nib as opposed to the bottom or the underside of the nib. And that, I think has to do with sort of some of the differences between how they finish nibs, or I should say difference.
So you said a burr at the top of the nib can impact. Explain that a little bit more, because that sounds very counterintuitive. You'd always look at the writing surface on the bottom of section of the page to cause that.
Yeah, but you're well, I was going to draw it, but to make it simple, that, if you think of it, right, if there's my fist is looking at the nib from the side, right? So if where the top of my knuckle is, right, or the top of my index finger is hitting the paper, right? As your hand goes back and forth and all these things, the nib is moving in ways you're not even intuiting. And so you actually, a lot of it is hitting the different areas of the nib. Because if you think about it, right, like if you're going backwards, like you're thinking, oh, well, I'm hitting the underside of the nib. The top is still like dragging against the paper. And obviously if you're going forward, then the nib is, digging in, but you're still getting that like edge hitting the fibers of the paper. And similarly, when you're going side to side, like that point is still having an impact on the feel.
Interesting.
So you see that a lot in Japanese extra fines. Yeah. And again, I think that it's not anything, I don't want to, it's a methodology thing. And so again, some people don't mind it, and there's a reason they do it in certain circumstances. But like I'm working in a different capacity when I'm doing cuts, right? Because I'm using like typically the diamond wheel. But a lot of nib people, technicians, manufacturers, whatever, are working on some variation of a drum. Yeah. And you'll see if you go to a pen show, a lot of the nib folks have like these bench legs, and they have drums in them, and then they're like going at the nib like this. Again, it's just a methodology difference. But if you think about it, if you do one of these moves, right, where you bring it against there and you smooth the side, you got to also think about, what am I doing here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And the talented people do that, like Gina does that, I've watched them do it. But again, if all you're doing is using the stone, it's not a problem, because you can recreate some of those moves using sandpaper. Yeah. So for example, if I I was showing this medium nib before, if I wanted to take out a little bit of a burr on top, personally, my move is to just go like this, right? I gotcha. Just sort of brush it down, and then use like the 1200 micro mesh a couple times just to like sort of wipe it off.
That's why I like these pads, because they got some give. So you can get some of the rounding, because the nib point's going to like make a little dimple in here. And essentially it's going to get it at the sides at the same time. So I'm polishing and smoothing, but if you do the pressure right, it's going in a little bit, and then it's going to get those little edges, and just do the things that like you're so restricted with that manual mode. So you got to sort of get a little creative when you're just doing DIY homegrown. And
that's why I like the what's it called? The
nail buffers.
The nail buffers.
So you use those too, hey?
Yeah. There's so many different things, right? Like talking about the top of the nib. Sometimes like I just need a little bit of like smoothing it down. I don't need a lot. In fact, if I use something stronger, it's just going to create another edge like further down the nib. So I just want to get it like a little bit off. Like I just need like a tiny bit off, right? So to your point, like you can hit it on the white, and that will, and since it has a little give, like it'll go into it a little bit. You're not. I don't want to tell people to press into it,
but it's just it's yielding.
Yeah, exactly. It yields, and so like it'll cradle it a little bit at a microscopic level.
Soft little. I think that's why I like doing nib stuff, because with all my engineering, it was precision laser gear. And so if we had to do, let's just say this was a part or whatever it is, the samples, like if this was something that we manufactured, this would go into a scanning electron microscope. Yeah. And then we would check, 50 samples to all the micro little changes that you did in that process to see what one gave the best results. And so you would have in-depth conversations about all these little details that would come into
Yeah.
it. So coming in and working small, like to me, I was like, you're just taking some metal off. What's the big deal? Like, because I'm like, that's not that to me, that was like, whatever. And I thought, worst case, I'll send it to someone to fix my work. But I do enjoy it because there is that, you're really highly hyper focused on something. And
Yeah.
it's, when I hearing you talk, it reminds me of like a Michelin star chef refining his sauce or his seasoning, or just getting a slightly different ingredient. You get a different tomato that's grown in a different world to just bring the flavor out slightly different, to change the acidity in something.
Yeah. No, it's really, I mean, thank you. First of all, thank you. But I would say it is really kind of interesting like that. Like I just did this drop of what I'd call the Gypsy Queen. I can explain that. It's also Peaky Blinders reference, perhaps one of the greatest ones. But what happened when I made it is that the feel of it on the small side. So it's like basically a version of your reverse architect essentially,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious to hear like how you think about feel about the bottom. But I just feel like, as opposed to if I was just like smoothing a fine, or I had ground from a broad to a fine for some reason, the fine on the underside or on the bottom of it feels very different than any other fines that I do. And it,
Okay.
I think, has to do with some of the geometry of it. It's smooth, and I'm happy with it. I think people will enjoy it, and I've done it for other people in person, and they're happy. I don't want to disparage them about it, especially because like I sold like 10 of them in 12 hours. But it feels different, And so it's like I was actually kind of excited in a way that I had created something kind of like new for myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what it is it feels a little more rigid. Because of how the whole thing is shaped.
Yeah.
Because you end up kind of like with a fine that sort of is missing the top, and therefore is like more of a hook, and so it just has like a little bit of a different feel. I don't know how else to explain it. There's no burr that I was worried about, and I got rid of that in the initial development of it. But it is like it has a different feel. So it's like, yeah, you can get a fine from me that's like our normal cheesecake, but every now and then we throw some saffron in to just give it a new hue and a new taste.
When you checked your nibs, so let's say it was this pen, and I sent you my Mont Blanc 149, and you would have done a great job. What is do you have a preferred ink and paper? Because that changes things a lot, right? Because you might leave your shop and you're like, oh, this is perfect. This is one of my best pens I've ever done. And then I get it and I can go, I don't like it. Right. So because I could use a different ink and paper setup than you. So I'd like to know what you use, and just maybe something to let people kind of know in mind if they aren't satisfied with something, or just something to consider if a pen isn't writing quite the way you want. What could you do?
First, let me say I try to do everything so that it doesn't matter what the pen and ink setup is.
Okay.
And how do I achieve that? So first of all, I use Rhodia, standard Rhodia, like I was just holding up. I have like these memo pads with the grid Rhodia. Why do I like Rhodia? I think that this one is uncoated, and if it is coated, it is very minimal. The inks, though, what I try to use nothing fancy. And what I mean by that is that, and I'm going to say something that's going to sound fancy, I think, actually, in retrospect. But my typical is Diamine Prussian Blue. Okay. Because it's a very light ink. It's viscous. You can dip it and it's wet, but then it's also not that heavy, so I can feel a lot of issues with it, and it's also easier for people to clean out of their pen, particularly at pen shows. We're like inking it up completely sometimes. Lately, I've been using I like had on my desk also Edelstein inks. So I have aquamarine. I'm
Okay.
the Pelican hub master in New York. So
Okay.
over the years, I've acquired a lot of pounds of ink that get left over. So like right now, I have aquamarine and I have the tanzanite, which again are both to me like you can see shading, you can see enough going on, but it's not so heavy.
Okay.
I don't want the heavy, gunky inks because
Yeah,
I
no
want
shingers.
something thinner. Yeah, I want something thinner so that I could detect problems easier. Because
Okay.
the thicker inks could lubricate and mask the problem, so I
I
want to
gotcha.
avoid that. So yeah, so it's basically rhodia, diamine, and I use diamine blue black as well. So
I'm a big
it
Parker Quink washable blue just because it's
yeah
just you could spill it on your hand and you're like, oh, just
yeah
wash it off. Yeah.
yeah.
And
I
it's
was
pretty good
using
too.
yeah yeah no, it's
And it's
really
cheap.
you could use the Quink, you could use the Waterman. I kind of switched back and forth between the blue black and the Parker
Mm,
Quink. I use the Prussian blue a lot mainly. It's actually big at pen shows for me because again it's like lighter and it cleans out
yeah. 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 Yeah.
easier. Pretty much all the scribes are done for no real reason, just how it worked out. All the scribes are done using um, the Edelsteins,
Okay.
um, particularly the aquamarine. So if you get one, I clean them all before I send them to Esterbrook. But sometimes I guess there could be like a little bit of residual ink. You might see a little bit of like a aquamarine color. That's straight from the desk of Joshua Lax. So
Oh, a question. We were talking about feedback and that. One thing is
Yeah.
some pens they squeak when you write with them.
The
Squeaky
squeak.
nibs. What causes the
Squeaky
squeak?
nibs. So it's all about space. So basically, what's happening is for one reason or another, either it's the way the feed is fitting to the nib, or there's something about the shape of the tipping that's pushing something away from the feed or from some other surface. And it's creating, when that happens, there's vibrations caused by the space. And so it starts to sing. That's like what it is. So,
Is that a little gap in there?
yeah, that could be it. Now, okay, so that is one version. As I'm
Okay.
talking about this, I realize are you asking me what's that like noise when you're writing?
No, like maybe what's causing it? Like why does it? Because like people who have a pen that squeaks a bit, they know it's like that little, like you said, sonic little, and it doesn't bother me at all. But I'm just
Yeah.
curious, like what's the source?
Well, so that is so if it's the ringing, like the
Yeah.
type thing,
That.
that's space and
Yeah.
vibration. I don't know if you can hear this. That is friction. Otherwise, it's just
Yeah.
friction.
What's your favorite? Like as far as like your personal preference for nib?
Well, so in terms of shape, I would say it's typically if I make a nib for myself, it's a stub.
Yeah.
I have some cursive italics, like I get that, but I like stubs better. I have atrocious handwriting, as the diagram of the thing showed. I'm really actually not that good at writing. I can do a little bit of drawing, but
Yeah.
my handwriting is awful. And so it works as a lawyer because no one can read what I write, but the for the rest of the world, it's a problem. So I like stubs because they're very forgiving and they I think it looks good on my handwriting and I find them very comfortable. In
Yeah.
terms of actual like nibs that exist in the world that I've used that I love, I have a Parker Centennial from the 80s, 90s
Mm-hmm.
duofold. It's in the like a crushed red burgundy, and it's a broad, and I like love that nib. I have a couple Pelican nibs I'm really into. I just sold it, but one time I made myself an architect on a titanium nib, and it was an amazing
Just
feeling.
cool.
Yeah, and then actually I have it here with me. I brought it special for the show is because I want to make a plug to all the viewers out there. But there's something magical that you're missing if you've never tried a vintage fountain pen. Why do I say that? I say that because you get to write with something that's no longer made in any capacity. And the nibs themselves feel different. Like you actually get a different feel. That's, you know, that nib is never going to exist in that form ever again. And you'd be surprised how good a condition a lot of them were actually in because they were so well made for something from over 100 years ago. You can find many great nibs, and I encourage everyone to go to pen shows, to pen clubs, and just try writing with people's vintage pens and see what they're about. Yeah, they're a little bit challenging sometimes. Yeah, they have different filling mechanisms that need to be restored. But I would just encourage everyone to take the opportunity to try the sensation of a vintage pen because there's many variables. One thing to think about in this regard is that back 100 years ago, when fountain pens were ubiquitous, fountain pen companies had extreme capacity to create things in varieties that we are not able to do for economic reasons today. And so you can, and if you think about people just hanging out in a factory all day, they had numerous supplies and other things to just mess around with. So every now and then you find something really crazy or really exciting. And that, you know, if you're a fountain pen user, it gives you a whole new sensation. Might it be too expensive to buy? Perhaps. But I would just encourage everyone to try writing with one. And if you get interested in what it is, go online, read about it. There's a lot of great articles. There's some great books about vintage pens. Richard Binder's website has a lot of great information just about sort of general information about models and filling systems and types. It's something worth knowing about, especially if you start to feel like, oh, I have enough plastic tubes. I need something with a little more panache, right? And I'm actually very happy to see the variety you have there.
This
you know.
I've always thought about the E95S, but
Yeah.
whenever I saw the new ones, I'm like, meh. And
Yeah.
then I saw this vintage one and I was like, oh hell yeah. Like it just there's just some cool things that aren't done anymore. And I love, and that was one of the questions. You know, what are your thoughts on vintage versus modern as far as which ones, you know, write better?
All right. So that is a great question. It's a super great question because it has a few different twists and turns or a few different nuances to it, right? So first, recognize one thing, right? There was a time when everyone had fountain pens, you know, and no one used ballpoints because they just didn't exist, right? So you either had a pencil or you had a fountain pen. There was no other option. Maybe you had some sort of like quill thing, but whatever. And so what did that mean? That if you had one or two fountain pens that you used frequently, right? What that means is when you write with it every day for 30 years, 40 years, it dropped, whatever, you know, you wore into it, right? So if you think you had a really good pair of shoes that you could wear again and again, and every so often you just had to replace the soles, you could think about a vintage fountain pen a little bit like that. A really good pair of shoes a lot of the time. Not everything's like that, but there's a lot out there that is. But going back a second, right, with the paper, again, paper itself is an abrasive. And if you're writing with the same pen day after day, year after year, decade after decade, it's going to wear a little bit and it's going to have edges and stuff like that. And so keep in mind that you might pick up a fountain pen at a pen show and dip it, or, you know, somewhere, flea market, whatever. You put your finger on it, it feels sharp or something. That doesn't necessarily mean it's damaged. That just means it's worn. And we can take out the worn nib as long as there's enough tipping left, right? So that's the first thing to recognize. And so underneath that wear and tear might be a really great experience lurking for you. Now, that was the first thing that I would say with vintage fountain pens. Are vintage fountain pens better or worse than modern fountain pens? That's not the right question I would submit anyone should be asking. What people should be asking is, what do I like and why is that? And should I be open-minded to other experiences if I really am interested in what this object is and its history and things like that? But even if you're not interested in the history, right, you can, what I'm saying is you get a really great experience. And that actually brings me to the pen I have here, because again, I'm in a different place than the bulk of my pens. But I brought down one of the first vintage fountain pens that I ever used, which is a Maybe Todd. I'm actually going to move the camera so that it's more in the lights for people to see, right? So this is a what they call the Swan Leverless. It's English. I'll get back to my love of English pens in a second, perhaps. But basically, This was the first vintage pen. I got it probably like for like $40 or something, and it had this like ridiculous broad oblique stub. And actually, it writes, but it's a little wonky. Like I have never actually tuned it. It has the top one tine is twisted outwards. The tipping is like all messed up. Like it's the nib is seated in the wrong position. It's like total ironic for me to tell you this is like the pen to use. But I filled it and wrote with it when I was like just starting. And actually, I think there's a crack in the nib too, just to add to all the hilariousness. But this thing it was such an enjoyable experience. And, I think, people talk about iridium, iridium is a real iridium. I don't know. I think different countries, they had different tipping materials. And this English, the tipping they used in England, I just always works really well for me. And so the writing experience was really great. The other thing was, as vintage pens go, this had a really interesting filling system. So what happens is there's a knob on the back, and you twist the knob, and the inside there's like a metal bar attached to the knob, and there's a rubber sack attached to the nib assembly. And so when you twisted the knob, and it's made out of ebonite, the pen is celluloid, you would press down, that the bar would depress the sack inside, push the air out, and then when you twisted the knob back, it would open the sack up, and that would suck the ink in, right? So it's a really easy, well-made, self-contained way to fill the pen. Yeah, it will probably need to be resacked at some point, but that's like, it's sort of like if you drive a car, you know how to change a tire.
Change the oil.
It's not that hard to, it's not hard to change a sack. It's really, there's not much mystery to it. And so for me, just like, I haven't used this, I actually haven't written with this pen in about 8 years, but I can like remember that sensation the first time I did write with it on paper. And so why am I saying this to all the folks out in YouTube land? What I'm saying is, so I got a celluloid pen with a 14 karat gold nib with an oblique stub. That's a little beat up, but is an amazing experience, and kind of like the Mont Blanc M over there. It was had for under $50. And I'm not saying that you can get deals like that all over the place, but you can get a really unique pen with a really unique experience, with a really different kind of like, well, differences all abound, right? Like, a different time and place it comes from, a different method of manufacturing, a different way of filling it. It's just an unusual thing, and it's pretty durable, I gotta say. Like, it is, although it's 80 years old and made of celluloid and hard rubber, like, it feels really firm and strong in my hand, Yeah. But I would encourage people to take the plunge and learn how to like sack an old Esterbrook or something.
Yeah,
and
my
then
first
try
one was
something from there.
My first vintage was an Esterbrook J series, and it came with the oblique broad nib stock, and it was really cool. And then I ended up getting this. This is a Mont Blanc 24, and it has a 14K stock oblique broad. And it just fits. It's piston filler, got an ink window, all that stuff, and it fits in the hand, and under $200. And so, a lot of folks think they have to get the big one here, and it's a very expensive pen, right? I got that smoking deal on that too. But all my Mont Blancs I bought secondhand, and I've all got really good deals on them. And so you can get, just because if you want to try the brand, just because whatever, but even just on its own, it's a great pen. And there's so many little gems like that are out there. And if you're willing to put some work into it, like I put some work into this one, it's super cool. And you just get, you get some, it's kind of like classic cars, right? They don't make them like they used to. And modern cars can be a little easier, like you don't have to rejet your carburetor, but you got fuel injection and comfort and all this type of stuff, but they are super cool. Like this snorkel filler with that inlay nib, like you just don't see this anymore. And in some cases for good reason, but it's also super cool.
One of the cool things that Esterbrook did early on is they created, and I think you actually have a video where you mentioned this, they did like the adapter. So you can actually screw And those nibs, you can hunt around for them. There's some great ones out there. I mean, the signature stub is a phenomenal pen. There's some sort of like flexi steel nibs that they made at some point that I've worked on, but I never really used. There's, firm ones, less firm ones, all sorts of stuff. Because again, it goes back to an era where there was enough economic incentive for a company to produce, 40 odd nibs or something like that, or 40 variations on a steel nib, that people could screw in and out in a standardized unit. And like, there was enough buyers for Parker England to make like a double broad stub on like a larger size pen as opposed to something else. So all of that, you get there's like a heritage to it, but you get the benefit of like kind of like the industrial revolution overlaying the found pen industry.
And the right economic conditions and the right time in history where this was the preferred thing. That was the instrument.
Yeah.
So speaking of, since we're on the vintage and we just kind of mentioned flex. So I got a couple vintage pens. This one isn't inked, but this is an Omos 556F with a lovely flexi nib. My little Pelican 140. I realize now I've left it ink for a bit, so it's a little bit. I should probably dip it, but just lovely flex. Now it's got. Now we go. Now it's writing, but it just has a very nice intuitive amount of flex to it. And then I just got this one. I'm going to be doing the review soon. So this is from the Good Blue, and this is his titanium flex. And it does a good job. The feel is different, but like my observation with vintage versus modern when it comes to flex is nib geometry seemed quite different. Material thickness seemed quite different as well. Like these nibs, like on this little Pelican, it's a very, very thin material, and if you compare that to a modern gold nib, so there just seems to be a huge difference in construction just out of the gate. Like we could make vintage flex nibs today if we really wanted to. If someone wanted to invest the capital and get the machinery and go through that whole process, and there was going to be an economic reward for it, you could do it. Like we can land satellites on moving asteroids through the universe and see to the start of the Big Bang. I think we could make a piece of metal bend the way we want, but there has to be an economic sort of incentive to it.
Yeah, that I think is right. It is a matter of economics because so if you think about you kind of hit on like 3 or 4 different issues related to why can't we have a flex nib today, right?
Yeah.
So why can't we have a flex nib? So, or a truly flex gold nib. I mean, some manufacturers will tell you they've done it. The things with the wings cut out, kind of like the Good Blue, make a convincing item. But if you've ever tried a vintage flex nib, it just
different.
doesn't feel the same, right?
Yeah.
So it is, right? Because if you think about, like, we start with, the shape is different. That is not so hard to overcome, right? You need a feed that kept up. Again, not like the craziest thing to overcome. I think what prevents people from truly getting to the point where they can mimic it is what you're saying, which is you would have to do a lot of R&D on the alloy to get it right where you want. Now, that being said, I have been trained, but I'm not yet ready for prime time, to actually modify like a Jowo 14 karat gold nib to write like a flex, like a vintage flex. And it's pretty good and it's pretty convincing. But it's a whole ton of work.
Yeah, it's a different approach.
Do it. And it, I think for a lot of people it would be cost prohibitive, and you couldn't, and it's not really a method you could do on a large scale. It's kind of going piece by piece. So that is sort of part of the challenge. I think someone will figure it out one day. I think steel also, I mean, some of those old Pilot steel nibs, like pretty flexy. Pelican made them in the 30s or 40s as well. So you have, and there was Italian steel nibs, I think, that also flex. So yes, there's a capacity for it, but it's just an R&D situation versus, the cost of manufacturing the stuff in the scale. And then you ask, so they look at it, right? Like how many people are really going to buy,
Yep.
A gold flex nib, again and again, right? So
Yeah, especially if you're
that's,
making a good job, they last forever. Like this thing's lasted forever, and it does a great
yeah,
job. So it's like you sold it once, and
yeah,
that doesn't make good economics for a company. Now,
yeah,
like to find the alloy, that's actually super easy. We have the technology. You can take this nib, put it under the instrument, it'll tell you exactly what's in it, like pretty damn
yeah,
close. But the biggest one I think is just like this nib started out to be a flex nib. And if you have to take a gold number 6 nib to act like it, you got to modify. And it's like if you wanted it to be a gold flex nib from the start, you would approach it totally different.
yeah,
Right. And so, yeah, it's just that initial, hey, that we don't do that stuff anymore. So no one continue doing it. And now there happens to be a demand for it again. But it's quite involved to get there. There is another material. I'll tell you after we're done because it's super top secret. My goal is to make
yeah.
a prototype this year.
Okay.
But it's a certain material, and the process is very tricky. But I checked with someone who knows a lot of stuff, and what I suggested to him, he suggested the exact same way. So I have a
Yeah.
goal. I'll see this year if I can do it, but make a flex nib that would just be off the chains and super soft to the touch.
Yeah.
We'll see.
It's also the alloy is one thing. I was also thinking, I think, with the R&D is like the geometry of it needs to be worked out a little bit. Like you can get like the kind of like the cutout of it, but like the thin, you have to like play with the thickness of it. Like,
Big
there's
time.
like there's some development that would need to take place.
The exact curvature, and that it's sort of like in golf, a shaft will have a kick point. So where it kind of kicks through, and you have it on a fishing rod too. You can feel that in a fishing rod. So same thing with the nib. There'll be a certain point where that's the point where the flex is coming from. And so having to toy with that geometry, and two, we've kind of moved away from smaller nibs and gone to bigger nibs. So it's interesting that, it seems most of the best flex nibs are actually quite small little nibs.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. I can't actually think of anything that's large that was flexible. Like I don't know if I've ever seen like a Waterman 58 nib that had any considerable flex. Like I think, like a patrician nib, just jumping out at me. Definitely not this big Schaefer Lifetime nibs. Those were like,
we'll wrap things up with a couple last questions. One,
sure, yeah.
Have you ever screwed up an expensive pen?
Have I ever? Thankfully, well, I guess it depends on your definition of screwed up. I definitely had a situation where like it caught wasn't like an expensive pen, but it was like a pen from like an Italian manufacturer that had like it was like a special edition and they were like out of business or something like that. Okay. And I just had like a situation where it was at a pen show, so it wasn't like in secret or anything. Yeah. But like the way it approached the grinder, like one of the tines just caught and like pulled a little bit, so it bent. But yeah, it snagged. Like this was years ago, but it was totally fixable. What I would say that, and this is not, I wouldn't say that I messed this up because it's not really me. It's just a fact of life. One thing to be aware of, from time to time, people want to grind vintage nibs or even just repair vintage nibs. And on the surface of the metal, it might look okay, but a lot of vibration may cause it to crack. Mm-hmm. And so you might lose the tipping or something like that. Or even trying to align it, it might be more brittle than it looks. And so you're going slow, but it just can't handle it. So that happens from time to time, but that's sort of, I don't think that's what the question is geared towards.
It's just curious if you had one where you're like, oh, damn. What's like the cheapest pen you worked on where you're like, oh, really? They're sending this to me? Like it might be a $50 job on like a $3 pen. Like what's one where you've been a little surprised that you're like, oh.
I've had people send me not like more recent Chinese pens, but like, pens from like like in like the early 2000s or something that were like, $1 plus tax on eBay or something, and they want it ground finer, which is fine. I'll do it. It just I'm always like a little surprised that they're like, taking the time with that, because also those are yeah. There's like the Jinhao, I forget which model it is. It looks kind of like the Sailor demos, like they're little, like they look like a 1911 almost, and they're like a
Okay.
demonstrator. There was a similar Monteverde looking thing. Anyway, those are like $2 a piece, and I was like messing around grinding those. But that was more for my own enjoyment rather than like a service to somebody.
Yeah.
On that issue, I would say for anyone looking to like really practice it, you can get really good nibs from China that are fairly inexpensive. They're not the best nibs, but they're pretty good for our purposes, meaning they hold up well if you're going to try and grind them. They don't fall apart. The Jinhaos I was mentioning a second ago, I felt like I was dealing with like press board, the metal version press board, where it's just like metal shards put together in some way. But I don't think that, I think they're beyond that now. And actually you can get pretty good steel nibs for practicing purposes. So like the Jinhao 100 nibs, what else did I was thinking? The Jinhao nibs overall, I think for practicing purposes are actually kind of good.
Yeah.
For that.
So if people need to reach you, what's the best way for them to reach you if they want to get a pen done or a nib done or just learn more about?
Sure. So I have a very, what I think is a very beautiful Instagram account where I take close-ups of nibs. So
Nice.
you can see a lot of the nib displayed. It's the handle is really simple. It's JJ Lax Pen Co. I have a website where you can reach me through. For pen shows, you can make appointments on it. There's a button you can just hit. Disregard whatever location it says it's at because it's just an arbitrary thing you have to list for the way the platform works. But I'll be in the next one is St. Louis, then I'll be in DC, then I'll be in Orlando, and then who knows after that. Yeah, so I love, as I said, I love meeting people. Feel free to reach out either through Instagram or through the contact platform in my website.
Yeah, and then just, do you know like a ballpark turnaround if someone has a pen that they want to get something done? What, just so they can work in reality, what were they thinking?
You know what I always tell people is ask me at the time, because it as I think most people can imagine with like family, school schedule, work things, it tends to vary. Right now I've been very productive the past couple of months in terms of things. Sometimes it slows down depending on what my commitments are, so I try to give people the most accurate point of view
once they connect
as
with
I
you
can at the time.
All
Not
I
always
can say
accurate, but I do my best.
Is if you have a pen that you're just frustrated with and it just sits there anyways, who cares if it takes several months? Because I had that with this Visconti Homo sapien. I got a great deal on it. The guy said there were some baby's bottom. I got rid of it, but this thing wrote way too wet, and for a fine it was like almost double broad. And so I just never used it because it just didn't suit my style. I was so frustrated. I loved to look at it, so it just sat there. Then I debated if I should send it off. Finally I did, and it's like you're waiting for it to come back. It's like, well, it was just going to sit in a box anyways and not get used. Then I get it back and it is like exactly what I wanted, and now I use it all the time. So for me, a little thing on wait times, like whatever, it'll be worth it. How long are you going to use it for afterwards? Decades? Okay, so what if it takes 3 weeks or 3 months?
I would say thankfully most people have something else to write with these days, but I appreciate that you don't want it sitting forever like that. What I'll say is that anyone thinking of getting into doing nibs professionally, that is one thing to be aware of. There are examples over time of people who got too big too fast, and so I've been very conscious to try and moderate what I'm doing so it does not become a situation where I'm overcommitted.
I gotcha.
Because that can happen, and you don't want that, because that's like the worst thing. Again, not just for you, but for the community. And it's just we want people, and we want people to have a good experience, right? Overall.
And if they want to get some of your work sooner, they can pick up a scribe nib from Esterbrook.
Yeah, definitely check that out. And what I would say is, again, I love talking about this stuff. I helped found a pen club. Like, if people have questions and want to know things, you don't have to reach out to me solely for a business proposition. If you just want to chat and get my opinion on something, as long as it's not verboten, I will definitely share it with you. So
Perfect.
Um, yeah,
I think we'll leave it there for now. I don't know how long we've been going, but I think it's a long
yeah,
time. So I think we cover
yeah,
lots of topics. I hope people will find the video useful and
yeah,
a good resource as well.
yeah. And join us for part 7 next time on
Yeah.
feeds.
Beyond the feed.
Yeah, no, beyond the nib into the feed,
That's right.
the
That's
inner
right.
depths of the pen. Join us as we sink below the feed into the channels of the feed. No, I said Desi feed twice. Put that on the blooper. So
Perfect.
you can do
Awesome.
part 5 bloopers. All right. Thanks so much.